Sunlight floods the room. Palm trees reach towards the azure sky. The Pacific Ocean shimmered through the treetops. Thomas Mann's Arcadia. He saw this vista during World War II, as he wrote his radio addresses for German listeners on behalf of the British government. The Manns had been forced into exile in March 1933. After several sojourns throughout Europe and the east coast of the US, they finally settled in California in 1941. They had escaped. For nearly 5 years, Mann fulfilled his self-imposed radio duty. He viewed these speeches as his service to the world, a service that, in his speech from August 1943, he also demanded of the Germans. Be accountable to the world, not conquer it. Include it in your thoughts and actions, he at times vehemently urged. Mann occasionally complained about this service. It robbed him of time he needed for his literary output. Ultimately, though, he saw no alternative. Failing to actively oppose dehumanization and fascism, genocide and war, the repulsive system, the robber, murder and liar state of National Socialism, as he put it in his speech of July 1942, was not an option for him. Satisfied with his work output, Mann wrote in a letter to his friend Felix Braun in July 1943 that while he was actively working on his novel Dr. Faustus with his right hand, he would throw stones into Hitler's window with his left. But each hand would know what the other was doing, he assured the friend. Mann fought eloquently and with passion, in the hope the Germans would dare throw rocks into Hitler's window to free themselves from fascism. He pleaded and appealed. He warned and admonished. He enlightened and did not hesitate to vilify Hitler and his power scoundrels. Yet it was all for naught. The Germans did not chase the Nazis away. 15 years after the war, Hannah Arendt accused the Germans in her speech on receiving the Lessing Prize of hiding behind the lie that they knew nothing about genocide and the atrocities committed in their name, thereby reducing the horror to sentimentality. Many decades later, I listened to Mann's speeches to find out how he remade himself into a Democrat and tried to convince his fellow Germans to do the same. Meanwhile, in Germany, hundreds of thousands are protesting right-wing extremism and fascism. Friends and relatives keep sending me photos of the demonstrations, many of whom are taking to the streets for the first time in their lives. I regret not being there. The demonstrations were prompted at the start of the year by an investigative report that exposed a secret meeting of far-right politicians and stakeholders where they had discussed remigration plans. Certainly, nothing about these plans is new. Anybody who wanted to know could have known long ago what kind of society these forces intend to establish. Nevertheless, it is emboldening to witness how many people are now standing up for democracy and defending one of its cornerstones, the moral and political equality of all. They are fueling the hope that the milieu of recent years, which had seemed to have obstructed the political imagination and ability to empathize and act in solidarity, could soon be a thing of the past. That said, these demonstrations also point to the enormity of the challenge that liberal democratic societies currently are facing. After all, over the past decades, we have seen how fundamentally the neoliberal revolution has laid siege to the moral substance of democratic polities. It has done so by promoting hyper-individualism and favoring competition and rivalry over cooperation, while simultaneously discrediting models that prioritize an egalitarian social bond. Moreover, we have seen how democratically elected anti-democratic forces around the world have relentlessly been attacking democracy from above and from below and weakening it in the process. From above through partially unconstitutional actions such as the manipulation of free elections, the restriction of freedom of expression and assembly, and the curtailment of constitutionally protected basic rights, along with the rights of parliaments and courts. From below, through the mobilization of racist, anti-Semitic, misogynist, trans and homophobic cliches, through fake news, political intimidation, and verbal and physical violence. Halle, Hanau and Dresden, Nuremberg, Kassel and Cologne are just some of the markers of deadly fascist violence in Germany over the past 20 years. In the 1990s, British sociologist Stuart Hall emphasized the importance of democracies learning to live with difference. He astutely predicted that this would be the preeminent problem of the 21st century. Amidst the demonization of migration and migrants at the time, he urged us to embrace sustainable ways of living with difference and combating racist violence. Having now arrived in the third decade of the 21st century, we must, unfortunately, assert that Thomas Mann's hope that fascism would forever be defeated has not been fulfilled. Even Stuart Hall's plea that we learn to live with difference is not passé. More than ever, we are thus being called upon to intensify the democratic revolution and find a non-fascist answer to the fact that, in Hannah Arendt's words, human in the plural live on the earth and inhabit the world. So, how do we resist? And how do we repair and strengthen democracy? What would a democratic way of life look like that gives plurality central importance? I will address this briefly from two perspectives: how we exist in the world as individuals, and how we organize social bond. Let's begin by discussing how we socially bond. Suppose the diagnosis holds true that the neoliberal revolution, along with autocratic forces and regimes, has undermined democracy. In that case, we are now being called upon to deepen democracy, foster its institutions, and renew its promise. This means we need polities in which the possibility to govern collectively is not tied to status, class, or religion, or phantasmatic notions of race and gender, nor to the time of one's entry into a community. Instead, it must be based on unconditional membership to a politically established association that anyone and everyone can and should be able to join. In such a polity, every individual would have an equal say in decision-making processes, and the sense of belonging would not be imposed, but a result of common deliberation and agreement about what we have in common. A polity that empowers its citizens to build coherent, stable and equitable connections while being aware of the daily challenges this entails. And a polity that would strive to eradicate social and economic injustices, ensuring that every citizen receives equal treatment. A polity, moreover, that empowers its citizens to unlearn imperialist attitudes and structures of dominance and subordinations, enabling us to negotiate our common history by acknowledging how our differences are interwoven and hierarchically organized, as historian Satya Mohanty put it. Moving on to my second point, let's consider how we lead our lives as individuals. What are we contributing to the world? How are we making a difference? How do we serve it? How do we treat each other? These are the things I believe that Mohanty is referring to when he speaks about the hierarchically interwoven differences that he urges us to work on. It requires, I think, first to be listening to others and responding to them, even if we don't agree with them. It's a kind of work that cannot be forced and by no means excludes disagreement or conflicts. I want to call this a practice of accountability. It is a profoundly democratic practice, a practice that we owe to each other, not a one-sided duty. Rather, it can be conceived only as a mutual practice of responsibility, not just for what is mine, but also for what is not mine, in the words of the Jewish-American poet Melanie Kai Kantowitz. Hannah Arendt called such an attitude towards the world and others political friendship, the readiness to share the world with all. Relentlessly, Arendt advocated that we befriend the world and people in such ways. Under no circumstances, Arendt pleaded urgently, must we turn our backs on the world. Arendt's amor mundi evolved in the long shadow of the Shoah. She envisions a society that continuously questions itself and rejects violence, even in the face of global atrocities, by having an engaged and active citizenry. This requires us to actively resist the temptations of individualism and the idea that we should only care about ourselves. Citizens practicing amor mundi are respectful toward others, share public spaces, and collaborate to solve global challenges. In Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk's Nobel Prize speech of 2019, 60 years after Arendt's Lessing speech, we encounter a new take on amor mundi. Where Arendt spoke of love for the world, the latter offers us the image of a narrator tenderly facing the world. Tenderness here does not mean the kind of love that Arendt called pure passion, that threatens to destroy the worldly space. Instead, Tokarczuk's concern is the world, rather than a single individual to whom we can devote ourselves with skin and hair. Tokarczuk offers us a vision of citizenry that is devoted to the world with affection, but not in a romanticized fashion. A civic culture that takes care of the world with all its imponderability, contingency, and unpredictability. A social grammar of polyphonic connection, fully aware of the divisions in the world and willing to bear witness to them. A political sensibility based on the unconditional moral equality of all and geared towards their well-being. History knows Hannah Arendt disclosed to her audience in Hamburg of many periods of dark times in which the public realm has been obscured and the world becomes so dubious that people have ceased to ask any more of politics than that it show due consideration for their vital interests and personal liberty. One could justifiably claim that such times might be called dark times. For Arendt, such darkness is dystopia. It symbolizes a world in which people have abandoned one another and destroyed the space of appearance between them. A world in which they no longer respond to each other and only move closer to those they perceive as being familiar, showing no interest in anybody else. A cloth for a world bereft of concern and conversation. This is a world where fear-mongering communication prevails, ignorance and disrespect are rampant, and oppression and violence are denied. A world based on rivalry and resentment, greed and woeful connections. All of this has turned the world into an object, says Olga Tokarczuk, one that can be cut into pieces, used and destroyed. Nothing sheds better light on Olga Tokarczuk's tenderly inclined narrator towards the world more than Arendt's image of dark times. Tokarczuk reminds us of the necessity to repair the world and embrace difference. And this means, above all, if we are to escape from being constricted in breathless, reified and reifying states of domination, from times in which atrocity has become ambient, we must reinvent caring in solidarity as a global political practice, actively resist the normalization of violence, and encourage tenderness towards everyone, regardless of their belonging and identity. For this is the essence of democracy. Whether in smaller towns such as Jena, Bautzen, Stralsund and Görlitz, in St. Wendel and Aachen, or major cities Munich and Berlin, today's demonstrations mark a beginning in this respect. The protesters are demanding more than just their personal liberty to be taken into consideration. They are, finally, daring to throw rocks into the windows of darkness and kindle a light, regardless of how weak and flickering. They have made Thomas Mann's service to the world their own.